Hello, welcome back to the next video of this Intro 32 Genesis build for the Clubman Nationals. And so far you can see we've built up quite a lot of the chassis. Got the chassis all ready, we've got the motor in, we've got the rear bushes in, we've got the axle and the gearing and gear mesh all sorted. So today's video is all about preparing the guide and the lead wire. Now, I've done a few videos, or a couple of videos on guides. I'll put my early one up here, a link to that one. You can see how I go about preparing a guide. But obviously I'm going to go through a little bit more today about some of the parts I'm using to finish building up this car. So you can see they're all from Mid-America, and you can see their designations or their part numbers on here. So let's get on with the build. Now, I was quite surprised at how many parts actually go into just doing the guide and lead wires. You know, you've got these washers here. I might be using more than one of them. We'll see how the guide sits on the chassis and how much spacing I'll need. But there's also these really thin washers as well. So these ones here, I say, are 3 thou thick. These are 20 thou thick. I'm not too sure if he does some in between for Mid-America. But I'll make do with those sizes. I've got more than one of them. They come in some packs. These silver plated clips, I'm quite liking these little silver plated clips because of course they don't tarnish unlike like the brass ones. But I think I'm probably only going to use one of them, and you'll see why later on. These guide nuts, really nice. They look very much like the JK guide nuts, but these are available in lots of different colours, and I think after the part number you put the colour after it as well. We've got a guide here, and I'll show you that in a little bit more detail closer up when we come to install it, and some braids. Now, these braids, I think they're quite stiff braids. They might get a little bit softer when I sort of thin them out a little bit and work them a little bit. And then a nice pack of lead wire. This is really great lead wire. I really like this lead wire. It's really good. You get it in a little long pack like this, and I'd say it's probably some of the best lead wire that you can actually get. So here's a close-up of the guide that I'm going to start with, and this is the Mid-America guide. I think it's the carbon version, hence the C at the end of the part number, but it's also come threaded. I'm not too sure about the quality of the threading on it. Looks all right. I'll only tell when I get the guide nut down on top of that, but we can see they're quite a chunky guide. There's quite a lot of thickness here at the base of the guide and around where the braids and the clips push in. So it's going to be quite a strong guide, I'm pretty sure about that. It's moulded not too badly. If I look at it like that, you can see that these edges are slightly misshapen. They're hanging down a little bit. I suppose as long as they're even, it doesn't really matter. But I'm going to clean that up in my preparation anyway. And you can see, again, there's maybe a couple of sort of moulding flashes here around where the post is, which I'm going to need to clean up as well. But overall, quite a nice looking guide. It's got a slight angle on the front of it, which is very good for tracks where they're made of sections and perhaps the sections don't line up perfectly, or there's little gaps in the slot. Angling the front of your guide like this really helps with those and gives you a much smoother flow around the track. So I'm going to start by cleaning off these little flashes here. Now, I've got a couple of tools for that. If there was quite a lot to clean off, I've got one of these end mills here. It's got a hole down the middle of the size of the guide post, and you can put it on to that and you spin it round and it cleans up. Not only does it clean the post up, it also cleans the base of the guide up. It's quite a tight fit, this one. Now, just slide something into there and twist it round like this. You can see that it just cuts the base of that post. There we go. Let's pull that out. I'll show you. So you can see I've just cut the worst of the flashing off of there, and you've got to be careful. You don't want to cut too deep. I don't think I have that. Yeah, there we go. That's just the edge of the cut. So there we are. Clean that off, and that gives you a nice flatter base to the post for it to sit on the guide tab. And I also got one of these tools, which is really good for finishing them off, which is again a diamond ended tool rather than actually an end mill with a cutting surface. It's got more of a grinding surface, and again that fits over the post, and you can just run it like that onto your guide and you can clean off that bottom surface. So when I am cleaning up the guide, I do like to have it in a little slot like that to know that I'm being precise. I'm not bending it in my hands as I'm doing it. So I'm going to put that tool on top, just give it a bit of a spin like that. So there you can see all the way around I've got a very nice base of my guide which should sit nicely onto the guide tab of the chassis and hopefully stop any wobble from that guide. Next up, we prepare the braids. It's not just a simple case of just stuffing them into the guide. Let's have a look at the thickness of that braid to start with. So we get something like 0.6 millimeters. What does that translate to? 24, 23 thou, something like that. So I'm going to be rolling the braid out a little bit to thin it out a little bit to make it a little bit softer and it move nicely. And I need to bend the clip over. Now when I bend the clip over, I often find that the clips stick out too far beyond where the braid is clamped in. So pretty much on all braids, I just take my pair of side cutters like this and I cut off about a millimeter and a half like that of braid clip on the end, just to make sure that when I fold it over, it's not going to stick out. And then when I'm folding it over, I tend to fold it around the end of an Allen wrench, an Allen tip like this, so as not to fold it too tight. And now you can see, even when I folded it over there on that fold line, if I'd have left it where it was before, it would have been sticking out beyond where the braid is actually clipped in to the clip itself. So I'll show you on this other one. So again, if I take this other braid here and I were to fold it about that point there, you can see that actually it would be sticking out too far. And what that could cause is if the braid is into the guide like that, it could chop the braid, or if you're going to put it in the other way, and the guide will be sticking out the front of your guide. And that wouldn't be very nice at all. So I always trim these off that little bit shorter. So I've trimmed both guide clips off, or braid clips, sorry, trimmed them off. Now it's time to roll the braids. Now I've made myself this little roller tool here, like so. It's got a roller on the end, and that's really nice for rolling out the braid without damaging it. So roll it on both sides. So we haven't thinned it that much, but we brought it down to 0.47 or 18.5 thou. There we are. But more importantly, the braid is slightly worked now, so it's slightly more flexible here and not quite so hard as it was before. So now we move on to these silver plated clips. Now, a lot of people might just clip them in the guide like that, solder a bit of lead wire to the top, push their braid in, and away they go. Now, I don't like these. I don't like doing it that way for a number of reasons. One, because the clip sticks out quite a long way at the top of the guide here. So therefore, when the body goes over the top, it means that your body can catch on these clips here. It can make big dents in your body, or it can wear your body away, or it means you've got to mount the body slightly higher at the front or mount your body further forward. So I don't really like the clips around the top. Also, if let's say you have an accident and you lose a braid, the clip falls out and then you've got to mess around, you've got to put the clip back in again, try and get the braid back in again. So that can be a bit of a nightmare in an accident situation. Also, obviously with soldering wire on top, again you're raising the centre of gravity even more by a heavier clip and moving the wire onto the top and making again more issues with the body going over the top of the guide. I suppose one good thing would be that if you did damage the guide or break the guide, it can be an easy job to replace the guide because you can just put the clip back in, the braid back in, and away you go. But I like to use a plate inside and solder the lead wire to the plate on the inside. Some people even take the whole lead wire and make the lead wire and squish it inside and use that as the actual plate itself that the guides or the braids go up against when you push them into the guide. So I'm only going to need one of these, and I'm going to cut it in half.
12 seconds later.
So I've cut the clips in half and cleaned up the end where I've cut them, and they should slide into the guide very nicely like that. And look, the length of them works out very nicely. They don't stick out the front of the guide. They sit back here ready to solder the wires to. So I think they're an absolute bargain, because obviously you get one guide from one clip. You don't even need a pair of them. So I'm now going to put the braids into the guide, and I didn't have to just squish the guide a little bit, or squish the braid clip a little bit to get it in, because where I'd folded it here, on a lot of guides that's okay, but this opening here for the braid seems quite small on this guide, and the guide being very strong also doesn't flex very much when you push the braids in. So I did need to flatten that down quite a bit on the end to get the braid to sit into the guide. And obviously I want the plate to sit on top of the braid, so I need to make sure that when I put the braid in, and notice which way I'm also putting the braid in. I've changed my method slightly from what I used to do on the guides, if you see my other video. So I'm now putting it so that the bent bit of the clip is more towards the top of the guide rather than the bottom. Now, the reason why I do that now is because a lot of the guides you get have quite an extreme angle on the front of the guide like this. And it means that if you did it the other way round, you end up with more braid exposed at the top end here, and it's more likely to get cut off. So I tend to put them this way round now, so that I can cut the clip back a little bit, and the braid is lower down and less likely to get caught in accidents or catch up on the body shell of the car. So that needs a good pushing in. Sometimes I use a little tool, just the end of a screwdriver, just to push the braid clip all the way in to seat it nicely in the guide. So with the braids pushed all the way home inside the guide, I'm now going to clean up this bottom surface of the guide to get it to sit nice and flat and square. Now, if I was at the racetrack, I'd probably be using one of my little portable lightweight Clevetech guide sanders. So again, you put your guide in there like that, and you slide it backwards and forwards, putting some even pressure on the guide itself. And if I just show you a little bit of what it does, you can see how it cleans that surface up on the bottom and flattens it all up. Now, if I'm at home, I want to speed the job up a little bit and take one and use one of these, just a little bit of wood with a slot in it with some emery cloth put on top. But that's not so portable, and it's much heavier to put in your slot car box to take away, but it does give you a much longer length to slide your guide, so you can do the job a little bit quicker. You need to keep going until you've flattened all of that surface of the guide. You can see where it's sanding it away. So we've got a little bit still to go here, a little bit round here where it's not quite sitting right. So a little bit more, and I think I'll be there. Now there we are. I'm happy with that. There's a tiny bit just there on that edge, but I'm happy that that is nice and flat and straight compared to what it was before. Now we're not done yet, because I'm going to start by rounding some of the edges of the guide, taking the sharp edges off the guide. That way, in accidents, things hopefully glance off the guide rather than dig into the guide a little bit more. So in order to do that, I've got again one of these diamond impregnated rubber wheels, and again I'll put a link in the description below of where you can get these from. But I'm going to use that just to clean off some of the edges of the guide. And there we have it. It's rounded off all the edges, nice and smooth, so that come an accident, there's nothing to punch holes in the body shell, and hopefully it will glance off of accidents or other cars rather than digging into them as much as it perhaps would have done before. So some people might ask, why have I put the braids in first and then shaped the guide and finished it all off? Well, I suppose you could have used an old set of braids in there for a start, not your brand new braids, but as I was building it up, I'm pretty careful, so I use new braids so as not to damage the braids. An older set would be better for that. But the reason why I put the braids in first is because when you push the braids in, it tends to misshape the guide a little bit and stretch the guide out of shape. So by putting the braids in first and then cleaning the guide up, you have it in its final form that it would be when the braids are pushed in, rather than cleaning it all up, pushing the braids in and finding out you created a big lump at the bottom of your guide where the braid clip has stretched the guide and therefore it's not in the right shape in the first place. So now I can think about bending the braids over. So again, I use the end of an Allen wrench, or you could use a little bit of piano wire. Just bend them over on the end like that. And then when you've bent them like that, you can see how there's a little bit of a loop there. And that loop gives you that nice ability to get your braids to sit slightly flatter onto the guide like that. So do the same for the other one. Fold it over like so. And give it a push, and then the braid sits much flatter onto the base of the guide. Not that I'm going to race like that with the braids totally flat, but it's nice to get that front bend nice and flat on the guide itself, and then you can just worry about the pickup at the rear end of the braids later. And we're going to do something with the ends of the braids later just to make them pick up better than leaving them like that. Now with this guide and these braids, they look pretty near the perfect length. They probably could be a fraction shorter. So at this point, I might take a braid out and I might put it into my CleaveTech guide tool or braid tool. And you can see that what you can do is you can adjust this braid tool. It's like a little jig, okay? And you can slide it along. You've got little markings on here. You can slide it along to the braid that you've already got correct. So let's say if this was one that was the correct length that I've just taken out of the car, or I've trimmed it in my guide, so I know exactly what length I want my braid to be. I could then take my new braid, let's say it was set like this, I could then take my new braid, bend the clip, get it all ready, and then I could just take a pair of scissors and I could trim the end of a braid like that, and then I could do a few of those, and I know they're all going to be the same length and all going to be correct to fit into that guide there. So quite a little handy jig if you want to prepare a few braids before your race, all to the right length, and get them all ready. So now we're getting closer to putting the guide on the car, but we're not quite ready yet. Got to prepare some guide washers. You say prepare the washers, you say? Well, yes, because again, they're not all ready to go. These ones, again, they're stamped out of a big sheet, and we've got little burrs on the bottom of the guide washer that are quite rough, and they need sanding off. So the best thing you can do is take a piece of wet and dry paper or emery cloth and then run the bottom of the washer on that emery cloth just to clean off all the burrs underneath the washer.
A few moments later.
So there we have it. The burrs cleaned off of the metal washer, and you don't actually need to with the Teflon washer. It's one of the only parts that I've ever found that's available in the slot racing world that you do not need to do any post-processing to once you get hold of the part. You can take one of these washers, these Teflon washers, take them straight out of the bag and put them on your slot car, which is very unusual because most things you have to do something to before you fit it to your slot car. So I said we're going to do something to the braids to make them work a little bit better on the car, and that's I'm going to roughen up the ends of the braids slightly. Now I've got one of these, this has got some sort of, I think it was some sort of like thin carpet tack glued to a piece of wood. Now, this is a brilliant braid tool actually, and it was made for me by a world slot car champion, and he made a few of them, but they're actually really good. You can see it's quite well used and well worn now, but I used that just to run over the ends of the braids like this to roughen them up. And this one works quite well on quite stiff braids, but I do it front and back of the braid, just picking up a few millimeters of the end of the braid, but you can see I've sort of separated out the braid a little bit at the end of them, and that's going to help it pick up better on the track. If you don't have one of these tools, then you can just use a wire brush, but be very careful you don't brush your fingers because it could actually hurt your fingers quite a lot. But a wire brush, again, on the ends of the braids can clean that up quite nicely, or open up the weave of the braid a little bit better. And you'll probably find that once you've done that, you might want to use a pair of scissors and just neaten up the ends of the braids once again where it's pulled them out slightly. So there we have it, one guide ready to go on to our Intro32 Genesis chassis. So from my experience of racing on the track that this is going to be raced on, we want to run the car so that these front ears of the car are pretty much touching the track on a completely flat block, not a recessed block. This block is flat. So basically I want these front ears to be, say, just a fraction clear or virtually touching the block when you just apply a tiny little bit of weight to the top of the guide post. And as you can see here, we're nearly there, but I think it's going to need maybe a couple of thin washers in there just to achieve that effect. So I put some washers under the guide tab here on top of the guide, and I found that there was actually about 9 thou, so I've used 3 of the very thin Teflon washers, and that gives me pretty much the right spacing under this chassis to just have a little bit of clearance at the front with a little bit of pressure on the guide, as you would get when you were racing. So I didn't need the 20 thou, but I'm going to use the 20 thou on top, because when you put the guide nut on, let's say I wanted to change the spacing of this guide at a future point. Ideally, I want to try and put a range of spaces in there that give me a good selection of ride height at the front. Now, the reason why I've put a spacer on top of the guide is because if you have all your spacers in place when you put your nut down, whether they be on top or the bottom of the guide, the nut goes down and it will tighten up. But if you, let's say you wanted to change your spacing, you could take a spacer from the top, put it underneath, or take a spacer from underneath and put it on top, and the guide nut would always go back to the same position again, because the spacing in between is always the same. It just depends on where the guide is sitting within that spacing. So by putting all your washers in place that you might likely need, means that the guide nut is always going to go back to that same spot, and it always means that if you spent the time and effort to get your guide nut to sit right on the guide, that it'll always go back to the same position and your guide will always sit nicely on the tab, rather than taking a few washes out, tightening your guide nut further down and it going a little bit wonky. So let's get this guide nut sitting down nicely on top of the guide. So I'll put a little bit of oil on it like that, just to make it slide down nicely. And then Mid-America make these guide nut tools. Again, they look very much like the JK version. And then I should be able to gently lock that into the nut and then gently put the nut down. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to do it on a flat surface down here and hold my guide wrench or guide nut wrench quite vertical and keep checking from the side as I'm putting the guide nut down to make sure I'm getting the guide nut down that thread nice and parallel with the thread, and it's going to sit nice and on top of the guide tab. If your guide nut has started to wander off, you can put a little bit more pressure on one side or the other as you're turning it to try and get it to sit better on the thread as you're putting it down. So I've got that guide nut wound down all the way home, and the guide can move freely. It's not jamming on either side. There's very insignificant wobble here on the guide. The guide nut sits nicely all the way around with no gaps, and I quite like that. Now, the choice to cut your guide post down is either one of these little cutting saws. These are quite nice. They come with most rotary tools. You get a little cutting saw like that, or a pair of side cutters, and cover your eyes and warn everybody in the vicinity where it's going to go, because when you trim the guide post off and it springs off, it could fire anywhere. So for this guide, I'm going to use a pair of side cutters. In my previous video, which you can see up here, when I was building a Mid-America Gemini, I used one of these saws. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to trim that off just there, and I'm going to warn people, say eyes, and there we go. We've trimmed it off. And I just probably need to just polish the top of it up. So again, I'm going to use my grinding wheel, my rubber grinding wheel with a diamond in it. So there we have it, all cleaned off on top, looking quite nice. The other thing to check is when the guide turns, make sure your braids aren't going to short on the chassis, which could happen if they're spread out too much or if they're too long. So it's just worth checking that do the braids clear the chassis nicely. Is there any chance of them shorting? If there is, then you need to cut your braids slightly shorter. So the final thing we're going to do in this part of the video is we're going to put the lead wires onto the car. And as I said earlier on in the video, I'm going to use this lead wire, mid 140B. It is the 22 gauge lead wire. I think he does some thicker gauge lead wire, but that's definitely not necessary for motors of this type. So the thinner lead wire is obviously slightly lighter and more flexible and will suit this car very well. Now when I'm doing lead wire, I always like to start from the motor end if I can. If the motor is installed, I like to start from the motor end and then work my way to the guide, because that helps me get the loops better at the front of the chassis and get them to sit nice and low onto the chassis and not crease up when the guide turns. So I'm going to start at the back. Now if you notice, this motor here has the positive towards the back of the motor. It has to be like that because the rules state that you have to install it with the writing face down or to the bottom of the chassis. So the red positive is on the back of the motor, and in UK that's on the right hand side of our guide. So it works quite well, and we don't have to swap the lead wires over or cross them over at any point along the chassis. So take the end of my lead wire, just use a knife, just run it round, trim a little bit of the insulation off, give it a little bit of a twist. Then I can take my electrical solder here, my 6040 tin lead alloy, and I can just flow just a little bit of solder onto the end of that wire, like so. And I'm going to do the same on the motor connections as well. But I'm going to be careful on the motor connections. I do not want to overheat the motor connections, because if I overheat them, then I can melt them too much into the plastic, and then that will ruin all my brush spring tension inside the motor. So I do need to be quite quick on these when I'm soldering them. There we go. So I've tinned the motor connections. I've tinned my lead wire. Now how am I going to route it through here? Well, I'm coming from the guide. The lead wire is going to come round like this. It's going to come into that outside loop, double back, and then come through there. So really, I'm going to start by putting it through that way. And then I'm going to loop it back through like so. I'm just going to leave it a little bit longer, and then I'm going to solder that to the motor to start with. Pair of tweezers is quite handy in this situation to hold your wire in place when you're soldering. So when you've soldered your first bit of lead wire, you can bring it through, pull it back through these little clips. So it's not too tight. There is a tiny little bit of play here in the lead wire. I've not pulled it so tight that it's pulling on the motor, but then I've looped it back through. I've closed a little loop up, and now I can work out how long a piece of lead wire I need to go to the guide. So if I sort of put the lead wire roughly where I think it needs to be, and then turn the guide like that, I then need to make sure that my lead wire isn't pulling on the guide nut or the chassis. So I'm going to give myself just a little bit fraction more lead wire. There it is. Just so it's not going to get bound up on the guide nut and pull on that guide nut when it turns like that. So it is clear of the guide nut. So that's the length I'm going to need. So then I can hold it in place, and I can just then chop that lead wire to the right length. Now I'll show you a closer up bit of here of the front. So when the lead wire is going to solder onto the guide, it's going to solder on like that. So I need to strip back enough insulation so that I'm soldering to the clip here and letting the rest of the insulation sit in this little slot because that will support the rest of the lead wire. So from there, I need to cut back approximately that much lead wire or that much insulation. So then I can again spin it in my fingers against the knife, strip it off, give it a twist, and then I'm going to tin this end of the lead wire here. Now you need to tin enough of the lead wire so that it's going to solder to the clip, but obviously don't put too much solder so that it runs all the way down the lead wire and stiffens up the lead wire all the way down. So just be careful. If you do that, then it's a case just stick a new lead wire on. You've ruined the last one. So I now need to tin the little plate that I'm going to solder to. So hold my iron vertically above that plate, put a little bit of heat into it like this, to get it slightly warm. Then you can dab the solder in like so. And the solder then should spread nicely on the plate. Now I like these plates because they don't tarnish. Unlike the brass, which tarnishes and makes it harder to solder to, these little plates don't tarnish at all. So then I can take my lead wire. Notice I'm going to put a little twist. Look how I'm twisting this bit of the lead wire down at the back there so that it doesn't spring up when the guide turns. So I'm going to hold it in that position like that. I'm holding it in the right position to solder down onto that clip. In fact, I could probably just trim it a fraction shorter, like so. And then I can heat up the guide clip, heat up the wire, put it on, like so. And then at this point, I just want to check, is the lead wire moving nicely? Yes, it is. It's not binding up, it's not catching on anything. So I'm happy that that's going to work nicely. And then I'm just going to finish this lead wire joint off nicely to smooth up the solder all on the top. And there we have a nicely done joint on the front of the guide. And I'm just going to clean that up. I'll do the other one, clean them up, as in get rid of all the flux. So I'm going to wipe them with a bit of lighter fluid around there, and then I'll show you the end result.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
So there we have it. I've finished soldering those lead wires at the front. They're nice and smooth and shiny on top, so they're not going to catch anything. When I turn the guide, the lead wire stays nice and flat. It doesn't bunch up in the air and push the body up. So you need to check for things like that. And again, it's soldered carefully to the motor at the rear. And I don't think that's going to go anywhere. But what I might just do for neatness purposes and just to hold it all in place is I might run some super glue or some cyanacrylate down here, just on this little bit of lead wire here. It just helps to hold the lead wires together and makes a nicer job to stop the lead wires from wobbling around in corners and on track. So this stuff is great stuff. It's some of the stickiest stuff I've ever seen or ever come across. So I'm going to use that to hold the lead wires together. So there we are, that's sitting nicely. Can let that set. While I'm letting that set, as I said in a previous video, keep oiling these oil lights at the back. They soak up a lot of oil. And that's where we're going to leave the video for today. So we're nearly there. We've got some tyres to do and we've got a body shell to do. So they're going to be in upcoming episodes. But hope you've enjoyed the video. Again, remember, hit the thumbs up button, the like button down there. Keep subscribing, share this video as much as you can. Please comment, let me know if you've ever built one of these chassis. Let me know how you think they go. And I will see you again very soon. Thanks for watching.